Welcome everyone, my name's Kerry and I'm a psychologist and a trauma prevention strategist. I'm also a best-selling author, but I'm actually here to talk to you about the new book that I've got coming out, which is called The Trouble with Trauma. So one of the challenges that we have in life is that as human beings, we actually need connection to other people to be able to survive. And the trouble with trauma is that it creates a disconnect. So I want to try and explain to you and help you to understand why that disconnect actually causes all of our mental health issues. But let me just give you a little bit of background about who I am. I'm a late career psychologist, and so what that means is I didn't actually become a psychologist until I was 40. But the interesting part about that was that I'd had some really interesting life experiences to that stage. I also spent 15 years studying, so I'll probably explain to you about why I didn't get into it until I was a little bit older. But along the way, I also had some other really interesting experiences that helped me to understand why trauma is actually at the basis of all of our problems. When I was 28, I had two little girls, 2 and 4, and I got hit by a bus as a pedestrian. I came out of the Elton John Billy Joel concert and was having a fantastic time. Was with a friend, but had not really been in Sydney or anything. Didn't really know my way around. Got a little bit freaked out. Couldn't find a bus that would stop for us, walking along the road. And I made the silly mistake of running out from behind one bus straight into the path of an oncoming bus. And I didn't even look. I couldn't work out why I hadn't looked. But as it turned out, there was a whole bunch of things that would take me far too long to explain right now that actually made sense about why I had decided somehow that that bus lane was one way. Turns out it wasn't. So through that experience, I actually ended up with PTSD and suffered secondary depression. And as you can appreciate, that didn't have a great impact on my children or my family life. I struggled with that for a good year. And then in that year, I actually engaged in therapy, and the therapy that I engaged in is the same trauma therapy that I actually do now for other people. And that's probably a lot of people say to me, why are you so passionate about what it is that you do? But it's because I've lived it. I actually had that experience before I became a professional who was able to deliver the kind of therapeutic work that I do. And so when I kind of got into that space, I was really able to do it fully embodied, understanding that it really does make a big difference and it's important. So I want to try and take you through a little bit of an understanding about how trauma actually impacts our life. You see, our lowest vibrating emotions are the two that we know of as shame, which is actually our lowest vibrating emotion, and the next one is fear. And I'll explain to you a little bit about why these two core primary negative emotions that we experience are actually at the basis of all of our problems. And it's really important to understand that they're directly linked to what we know commonly as depression and anxiety. So many of you will have heard about attachment theories and understanding about why our attachment as human beings to each other is really quite important. But some of you might have heard about a thing called adverse childhood experiences. There was a movie brought out in 2016 called Resilience, and it was based, sort of a documentary base really, but it was around some researchers in the US who'd actually discovered, medical doctors, that they had all of these people who were kind of clustering together in terms of their chronic disease development and some of the health issues that people had around heart disease and that sort of thing. And quite, unexpectedly across the country from each other, they were working in the same sort of area. And they collaborated and in the end developed a thing called ACEs, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. Now, what's important about ACEs is that if you have more than 4 out of 10 of the assessments that they ask you to do to determine your ACEs score, you're more than twice as likely to develop a chronic disease and die 20 years earlier than everybody else. Now, I just quoted you the closing the gap statistics in this country. And if we could understand that and we could recognise why trauma-informed care would then actually resolve those issues, then maybe we wouldn't be actually having an argument about why we haven't been able to resolve that problem in 10 years. So I want you to understand too that there is one thing that also offsets the impact of your ACEs scale. And funnily enough, they've now termed that the BESES scale. So the BESES scale is about your benevolent childhood experiences. So if you had a really, supportive adult in your life, be that a teacher or if at least one of your parents was quite supportive, then what happens is that you end up with the benevolent impacts. And so that's what usually gives people resilience. So when we think about how is it that some people can have quite a difficult upbringing and yet somehow still be able to get on with life and move forward, sometimes they're just repressing it all, and other times they've actually got a whole lot of benevolent experiences that have actually meant that they can offset those issues. So what's really important is we talk often about the mind-body connection, but for a lot of people we've had this separation for a really long time, and I think medical science actually really struggles with how do we bring it back together. And I want to give you a really simple basic history lesson. So there was a philosopher in the 17th century and his name was Descartes, and Descartes is essentially responsible for derailing the whole of humanity down this path of your body and your mind are completely separate, which last time I checked, mine are still together in the same body. So how is it that we got this complete separation that actually means that even from a medical perspective, we look at these things really clearly as separate? You go to the doctor and the doctor kind of says, oh, you've got fatigue, you've got these things, oh, I've got no energy, oh, you must be depressed. They don't always do the blood work and make sure that there's not something else going on. Maybe they do, and then they decide that you're depressed anyway. But we need to understand actually what's underneath all of our mental health experiences, and it's great that now in this, this 21st century, we actually have a much better understanding of mental health. But Descartes derailed that for a really long time, because back in the 17th century when he wanted to do research on what was going on in our soul at the time, the only place you could actually have a look at what was going on in your body was to go to the church and try and do some cadaver research. Well, guess what? The church said, you're okay, take the bodies, but you can mess with their head, but don't touch the heart area, because that was where your soul was supposed to be. Now, he did some great stuff, Descartes, don't get me wrong, but the problem is that he's the father of modern medicine. And as the father of modern medicine, he's taken them down a complete path of separation between what goes on in your mind and what goes on in your body. Now, the interesting part is, in my book, I talk to you about the fact that actually this is really your brain and your mind is this central piece here, and I'm not the only person that thinks that way. There's a whole bunch of stuff that talks about what we feel in our body, and how what we feel, particularly in our gut, makes a big difference to then what we're feeling emotionally, because they're not disconnected. There are a whole bunch of neurobiological triggers and events that happen within your cellular pathways that you're not even aware of. You just know that you feel uncomfortable in certain situations and you'd really prefer to avoid them. Or you get that feeling in your stomach where it's kind of like, oh, I don't feel very well because I don't really want to be in this space. Now, what you're responding to is actually the vibration of fear, or shame, or lots of other different emotions. And you'll know this because when you walk into a room and you kind of could cut the air with a knife and you think, that was revolting, let me get out of here. That's because your body is actually picking up on the emotion in the room and the vibration of that emotion. There's a lot of research that shows our emotions actually do vibrate. We get these radio frequency things that we give off. Now, we all thought that the hippies were just kind of making that stuff up in the 70s, right? But it turns out that there's a whole bunch of scientific research to validate it. Now, why that's important is because if we talk about it from the molecules of emotion perspective, we can then understand how our emotions might actually be impacting our body and our physical functioning. And then maybe why, if we address something from an emotional perspective, we could potentially completely change how our body responds to that same trigger. Now, this is key, right? Because how else could adverse emotional experiences from your childhood impact your physical body? It has to be done from that perspective of understanding that they must be connected. We just don't understand necessarily how. Now, what's really important is that we're still learning, right? Even as scientists, we're learning all the time. There is so much new neurological research, neurobiological research, epigenetics, all of these things that come out that kind of go, wow, we learned something new about our bodies, like, DNA structures and all of that sort of stuff. But guess what? Even now we've learnt more new things about how DNA actually works or doesn't. The fact that we thought it was set in stone and you couldn't change it, and yet actually you can change it. You can change it a lot. And our environment impacts what's happening to the cellular functions in our body, which is why when I talk about your mind actually is a lot of what you feel in this central part of your body. And I'll talk to you a little bit later about some of those Eastern philosophies that actually get you in touch with your body. Because in Western societies, we tend not to do that. In fact, we disconnect ourselves from our body. And in fact, we teach our children to disconnect from their bodies from birth. How do we do that? That would be controlled crying techniques, right? You've got a child who's crying, you've fed it, you've changed it, you can't work out what to do next, so you just put him in the bassinet and go and make a cup of tea and hope they stop crying soon enough. We tell them that's what they need to do. We teach them to repress. And it's part of the reason that I think modern psychology's actually let us down a little bit along the way. So I'm going to show you why your childhood experiences then kind of give you the basis of what I refer to as your self-management system. And my job is to actually try and help everybody understand that they have a self-management system, what it looks like, and how to manage it. One of the things that I think we have to understand about what's happened to our society is, I said, we understand more about our mental health now, but I don't think that we really understand what industrialisation may have actually done to impact that physical element in our bodies and in our psyche. So if we stop and think about some of the things that seem to make a big difference to us now, we actually have to go back to the fact that we've industrialised and we've got to the point that we don't actually have to allow ourselves to be uncomfortable anymore. Now, why is that problematic? Well, because I don't have to get uncomfortable. I don't have to force myself to do anything. So actually, if I don't feel like it, I can just lay on the couch, watch Netflix and order Uber Eats. Now that's problematic because in days gone by, if I wasn't feeling that crash hot, but you know what? I had to go out to the family plot and the farm and pick out some tomatoes for dinner and work out where I was going to get a few potatoes and take a chicken and grab an egg. And I had to get up and I had to do those things and I had to push my body to physically allow me to meet those needs. I wasn't able to just lie on the couch and order Uber Eats. And I think that this is part of the problem. I think what's also part of the problem is that we do a lot of things that mean that we don't expose ourselves anymore to normal, natural environments. In Australia, we have a lot of skin cancer, right? So what do? We lather our children in sunscreen, we put them in hats and we put them in sunglasses. And then we wonder why we have a vitamin D deficiency and why mental health issues are getting worse. Our brains need light to produce the different neurochemicals that we need to feel good. Who knows, so they feel a little bit flatter in winter than they do in the summer. We've already started to talk about how, the recent bushfire crisis in this country has impacted people and how they've felt because we didn't really get a summer. We got a lot of overcast, grey, smoky stuff. It's going to have an impact and we need to understand that. I think that it's really important to recognise that one of the things when we start thinking about our mental health is that sometimes we have to work out how it is that we can take action. We need to stop being passive in it. We need to recognise that survival is miraculous, but recovery is a choice. I said to you I'm a trauma specialist, right? So I think that it's important to recognise that there are a range of different trauma therapies, and there are some really good ones that work exceptionally well. I think that it's also important to recognise that it's important to be able to do some of these therapies in an integrated way. A lot of people will talk about the fact that you can now do things like, yoga for trauma. Why? Because what we're doing is actually teaching people to be fully embodied in their body and feel what's going on inside. When we do that, we can get in touch with actually how our body feels and the experience of the emotion that we're having. Now, go back to what I said about this being your mind. There are a whole bunch of things that overlay each other. Yoga, we call them chakras. In Chinese medicine, we'll call them meridians. In science, we call them nodes of the CNS, your central nervous system. Guess what? They all overlay the same spot in your body. Now, we also talked before about how important your gut is in terms of, the connection to all of this. You know what? Your gut actually forms from the same part of your neural tube that your brain does. There's a good reason why we call this the little brain. There's a good reason why it's involved in things like anxiety and fear. Because when you need to get ready to do a runner because something scary is coming along that's going to eat you, right? Your body needs to evacuate to enable you to be able to be at your lightest possible so that you can get out of there. There are some things that we actually have that are biological. There are things that we have in our systems, the neurological, so how our brain impacts. But we also have a neurobiological connection. We need to understand that the things in our environment actually change the way our cells function. And what I believe is that trauma therapy changes the cellular functioning of your body. It would just be great if we could prove it. It's really hard to work out what cells do, right? It's really easy to measure that they're there, but it's really difficult to actually work out how, when we do certain things, what is that doing to the cellular functioning in the body. But in my new book, I actually talk about the fact that I've taken a lot of science and kind of put it all together. That shows that theoretically, it probably makes sense that that's what it does. So it's important for us to get connected to our bodies, to be able to know exactly how we feel. And then if we're not feeling great, it's important for us to take steps to engage in the right kind of therapies and other kind of activities that we know will help make it better. We know that if we spend time in the sunshine, it's going to make it better. We feel better. There's all these different movements, right? You've heard about, Wim Hof, the Iceman, and all of the stuff that he can do to control his mind to keep his body still functioning in really freezing cold temperatures. We know that if you've got pain or injuries or inflammation, you can go from hot to cold and back again, and it makes a difference to your body. Why? Releases a whole bunch of stuff into the system. We know things like high intensity interval training will build muscle faster than anything else. We know that intermittent fasting will help people lose weight. Why? Because our body looks for homeostasis. And when our body, achieves homeostasis, so if you go on a diet, you'll lose weight, but you plateau because it's the same low calorie. And that's why when we change it and we kind of go up and down, the body can't work out what's happening. So our body is used to things being predictable and the same. And when they're not predictable, the body's behaving as if it is a predictable level, which is why those changes then have a much bigger impact. So I think that it's important to recognise how our physical body and what we're exposing ourselves to actually makes a big difference. And then we've got to think about, how do we recover? So when we know there's a problem, after my bus accident, did I know that there was a problem? Oh, my word, I did, right? And I would never have said that I was the sort of person who would ever have experienced any level of depression. But I tell you what, that bus came along and whacked me from upside of the head when I wasn't looking and changed my life. But the therapeutic process that I went through at that time actually is probably the thing that saved my life, because it made it all better and resolved it in a way that I would never have been able to do before. And probably I would have gone on to now be sick and now not being as well and as well informed and be able to be here talking to you today about what we need to do to resolve these things. You see, because I actually believe that if we were able to undertake a regular process of resolving our traumatic experiences that we teach to our children and we completely engage in on an ongoing basis right throughout the course of our lives, I actually believe that we would resolve mental health problems. There wouldn't be any. Now, there'll still be some biological elements to certain things because we do inherit things. But I honestly believe that environment plays such a big part in the impact of how that problem is maintained, that if we actually had a way to intervene so that there was not that maintenance of the negative stuff, we'd be able to resolve it and move forward. I often talk about the fact that, one of the things that makes a person inspirational is the fact that they've had negative experiences and been able to come through it, but also be able to talk to other people about their experiences. When I published my first book, I had a few friends that kind of said to me, "Oh, Kerry, you tell people so much stuff, it's a bit personal, aren't you worried about what people will say?" And I'm really proud of the fact that I've reached a point where I go, no, I'm not worried about that. I'm okay with me. It doesn't matter what other people's perspective of me is, but as long as I know that in telling my story, if I can touch even one of you in this audience and inspire you to do something that actually means that you take one step forward and start looking towards where you want to go and what you want out of your life, if I can inspire in you a sense of purpose, then you're already on the road to recovery. Thank you.